community committed to preserving the vast customs of a vibrant cultural heritage.
Welcome to Darshan America, folks. We come to you from Washington, D.C. My name is Ramesh Bhutani.
And I'm Asta Verma.
Countries are coming out of recession and they're taking different approaches to what got them in there. For instance, one of the biggest reasons the countries went into overspending is because they wanted to bring economic parity, you know, what they call it, economic diversity. They wanted to help the people who are poor. Well, folks, that's on the chopping block. The biggest commitment is from the Great Britain. You understand, in Great Britain, the government there sometimes subsidizes the apartment in London, which is the most expensive place around the world. It's up to $160,000 a year they pay their rent.
Wow, that's a lot of money.
But now it's on the chopping block.
Well,
they're going to take it out, and the uproar is out there because, you know, in London, up to 75% of the London area is available for any poor people to live in, including St. John's Wood, where the neighbors are Paul McCartney, Yvonne McGregor, and Kate Moss and others. I mean, the expensive areas, they can live there, but no more.
Wow, it's like having low-income housing in Beverly Hills or something. But, you know, it's an interesting problem, right? Because on the one hand, you can understand why Britain is considering this, because they're hurting. Their economy is hurting just like our economy is hurting. On the other hand, I mean, let's take a simple scenario. If you didn't set up housing like this in parts of the city, you'd have huge disparities and populations that are just entirely rich living in one area. Meanwhile, the poor have to live in a different area. So imagine if you're like a school teacher and you got a job that happens to be in a very rich part of town. But the problem is you can't afford to live there. So you can't afford to live near your place of work. You have to live in the poor part of town because that's where the housing is. So you're commuting back and forth, sometimes across the city. I mean, you're creating a worse headache, nightmare, congestion, and everything else. So the city does itself well to have these housing blocks allocated across the city. It actually helps balance things out.
It was okay to come up with a policy at that time when the rents were cheap, but now it's creating deficits that are unsurmountable. You know, I mean, even in America, you know, there's such a thing called, folks, Section 8 housing.
Right.
Where you pay up to 30% of your income as rent. It doesn't matter how much the rent is, government pays for it, up to a certain limited amount. Now, I want to tell you, you know, Constitution, whether in Great Britain or here in the United States, does not allow for those things. Those are the things that are made by politicians to come around. Now, I don't know what the effect will be when they take it off.
There should be some kind of a gradual weaning off process, because you take away a benefit someone has enjoyed, which means a certain quality of life, and you yank it away. Well, you're going to force that person into a drastic reaction, whether it means moving out of their circumstance or perhaps cutting back. Though that person is not going to be able to contribute to the economy because they don't have that extra money to spend. I don't understand why the government just doesn't come up with a scale down or wean yourself off the program kind of approach.
You know,
where you're allowed this benefit for a few years and then it's gone.
But in America, you know, particularly here in Washington, D.C. area, poor people get money. Now they have said, well, you're only going to get it up to 5 years in your lifetime whenever you want it. I like that solution.
Yeah.
Up to 5 years we'll support you, but at some point you got to, you know, bootstrap yourself and go after it. And I really think that some of these policies are good, because then, you know, necessity is the mother of invention. And that's when I think people will say, no, I can't do this. I'm going to do much better and ultimately get better in life.
I agree, because what happens the other way is people who are now suddenly hurting much worse than they were hurting before this benefit might resolve to a life of crime or do other things that are, you know, not legal to try to supplement their income.
Yeah.
So you might actually be creating a problem where you're trying to solve a short-term benefit and get some money back instead of
Yes.
paying these out.
One of the other things that bothers me sometimes, cities, particularly New York City or Washington, D.C., they got these rent control laws. It's like they are telling private property owners, hey, you can't charge them. Help the government support the poor people. Yeah, my heart is all there with them, but folks, you can't tell private property owners control rent, make less than what you would make for your property in the open market. So I'm hoping that, President Obama and others are listening so they can understand that, look, it is becoming very difficult to support these positions under the present Constitution we have. And, we have a Supreme Court that's actively looking at conservative things. If this ever got into a Supreme Court, what do you think their decision will be?
Well, it's very obvious. If you've been watching the Supreme Court, then you will understand that they have a very pro-business slant, or actually quite a conservative stance. So, for example, the Walmart case, which was in the Supreme Court, where you had a class action lawsuit, and basically the Supreme Court said there was insufficient evidence against Walmart, but what they also really did was they took away the basis for the class action lawsuit, which sets a precedent now for other businesses. It basically means that the class action lawsuits are going to be much harder to pass through, even if they go all the way to the Supreme Court like this one did, because the court was unanimous in its decision.
But do you think it's a bad thing?
I think that it's going to hurt the social freedoms.
I think it was a social harassment. That's what I think.
Well, you look at the trend here, though, Ramesh. You look at what happened in Wisconsin, taking away collective bargaining. Now you have the Supreme Court rule against class action lawsuits and really making it harder for those class action lawsuits to ever come forward again. You're approaching a place where people collectively are losing their ability to influence and gain power by uniting.
But you have to be cognizant of the fact. Yes, business people also get advantage from the government, but they don't take money from the government.
I don't agree with that. You're relying on the rich having the moral grounding to say, well, I'm rich, I'm going to return back to my community or back to my wherever it is that I live by starting a business, creating jobs. But what if they just want to be rich and play with that money, which is...
I got a perfect article for you from last Sunday's Post, Life's Lessons from the Super Wealthy. Here is a guy who actually makes those estate plans and all of that. And he says he gotten to know rich people. And he wants to share his knowledge with you. First one, he says, having money is better than not having money.
Wow, that's, as if that wasn't obvious.
Money won't buy happiness, but it'll pay the salaries of a large research to say why you're unhappy. Rich people have a certain modus operandi. Don't become cash rich in time poor. In other words, there's a time when you say, I have enough. Because what